All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome. I know it's the Thursday before spring break, so all of you brave souls coming here. Instead of getting your spring break started, you're coming here to learn history. I love it. So welcome to our Mythbusting the Founding Fathers series. Today we're going to be talking about two of our founding fathers who are interesting. They're interesting in many different ways. So John Adams and James Madison. As far as John Adams goes, I'm going to start out the presentation. My name, by the way, is Sarah Reed. My colleague, Haley Stewart, is going to talk about Madison in just a moment. But we're going to start with John Adams. We decided to go in presidential order. So John Adams was president before James Madison, so that's why we're talking about Adams first. But John Adams, just a little bit of information about him. So he was born on October 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts, and died in 1826. Between birth and death, talking about Adams first. But John Adams, just a little bit of information about him. So he was born on October 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts, and died in 1826. Between birth and death, he experienced revolution, exulted in his wife and children, practiced law, participated in rebellion, and served in the highest political position in the nation. But who was John Adams really? Today we delve into his life and character, extricating fact from myth and exaggeration in an effort to better understand the first vice president and second president of the United States. So let's begin to myth bust this founding father. Oops. There we go. So myth number one, Adams was a terrible president. The reality is, not exactly. Yes, John Adams was a one-term president. He had barely even become president the first time. He won by a mere 3 electoral college votes. And yes, one-term presidents generally mean that guy did something that voters didn't like and didn't want him back for 4 more years. Adams was a smart guy who did not always make smart decisions, at least politically. That does not, however, mean that every action he took during his presidency was terrible. Quite the contrary. But it does mean that he did make some decisions that impacted people's perceptions of him and his leadership. And the 2 big examples of this are the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts. So in 1798, relations between the United States and France were tense. As a result of the French Revolution, the absolutist King Louis XVI had been deposed and decapitated. Multiple factions rise up to fill the political power vacuum that resulted, and the country, in the midst of civil war, goes to war with other countries as well, including England. The United States still had their revolutionary alliance with the French, but President Washington, seeing that no good could come from war with or against any European country, chooses neutrality instead, angering the French and promoting an undeclared naval war between the 2 nations known as the Quasi-War. By the time Adams comes to the presidency, the idea was to send 3 Americans to France to smooth over relations. Instead, they were met by 3 Frenchmen wanting $250,000 to Talleyrand, who was the French Minister of Foreign Affairs under the then French government, the Directory, a $12 million loan, and an apology from Adams for remarks he had made about France that the French thought were insulting. Not only did the French want a bribe, which was bad enough, right? They had also worriedly closed French ports to neutral ships, saying that neutral ships, i.e. American ships, carrying English-made goods were subject to French seizure. The resulting report to Congress on what becomes known as the XYZ affair, a reference to the 3 Frenchmen who wanted the bribe, they were called X, Y, and Z in the American report, led to a surge of patriotism and a favorable view of Adams, who was reportedly consumed with writing notes back to those writing to and praising him. The quasi-war intensifies between the United States and France. The U.S., a brand new nation, had no navy to speak of. We hardly had an army to speak of, quite frankly. And the French, much more powerful, began attacking U.S. merchant vessels, further complicating relations between the two nations. It did not help that the United States still owed the French money from the American Revolution. The French also considered themselves justified in stealing American cargo and impressing American men, for they believed it was all in proportion to the Americans securing a treaty, Jay's Treaty, with France's great enemy, England, instead of fighting on behalf of the French. So, did Adams give in to the fervor for war, especially in Federalist circles? Not quite. And this is where we can say he acted with reserve and caution in a tenuous situation that, quite frankly, could have ended badly for the United States, embroiling the nation in war. While publicly he stated that the U.S. was close to being drawn into war, he did not jump on asking Congress to declare war against France. In fact, when learning of the XYZ affair, Adams's thoughts resemble those of a leader thoughtfully contemplating his next move. He was upset with France for sure, mentioning the transgressions against American merchants, but he maintained that peace was the goal. When Republicans in Congress learned of the seriousness of the situation and the full extent to which France had acted against diplomacy in trying to exact that bribe, some Republicans were wary of releasing that information to the American public, convinced that many would support immediate war with France. According to historian and Adams biographer David McCullough, this was Adams's worry as well. Nevertheless, Congress did appropriate money for more U.S. naval ships, so we do see a little bit of a naval growth at that point. In the meantime, Alexander Hamilton called for a buildup of the Army. So Congress created a provisional army of 50,000 men, just in case war with France did break out. Washington assumed command. He came out of retirement, although he did tell Congress, hey, I'm not going to lead an army unless you need me to use it. It's like, I'm going to come out of retirement, but I'm not going to lead it officially until you need me to be there. Hamilton was second in command. However, it is important to note that several of Adams's biographers suggest that Adams did not seem inclined to move on ramping up the army. As significantly, when John Marshall returned from France, he was one of those men who had been sent over as part of the XYZ affair, or what becomes known as the XYZ affair. He told Adams that France had no appetite for war, and that Elbridge Gerry, who had remained in France, had done so only because Talleyrand had told him that if he left, it would be war between the two countries. When Gerry returned to the United States in October of 1798, he reiterated to Adams in a long private conversation that the French did not want war. So, armed with this information and feeling more confident that a peaceful resolution remained an option, on February 18, 1799, Adams sent a message to the Senate that read in part, quote, always disposed and ready to embrace every plausible appearance of probability of preserving or restoring tranquility. I love that the 17th century uses so many words to say very little, right? I nominate William Vans Murray, our minister resident at The Hague, to be minister plenipotentiary of the United States to the French Republic, end quote. In a sense, or in a very big way, I should say, he chose peace. David McCullough claims that this was the, quote, most decisive action of his presidency. It was a brief statement, but as strong a statement against war with France and advocating peace as Adams had ever given. He could have asked for a declaration of war, but he did not, holding out hope for peace and waiting for a time when France would be willing to accept diplomacy instead. By 1799, France had made some overtures toward peace, including releasing embargoed American ships. By 1800, the situation in France had changed dramatically. Napoleon Bonaparte, the general who had been winning battles across Europe for the French, stages a military coup to oust the ineffective Directory, placing himself in a position of authority. He would declare himself emperor by 1804, but in the meantime, he sensed an opportunity to smooth over relations with the United States. On September 30th, 1800, France agreed to provisions under what was known as the Convention of Mortefontaine, letting the United States out of the U.S.-French alliance of 1778, reiterating the friendly relations between the two nations and ending the quasi-war. Adams had done it. He had negotiated a difficult path forged before his own tenure as president, and in the face of mounting congressional and public pressure for war, to find a path promoting peace. Not bad for an, quote, old, querulous, bald, blind, crippled, toothless president, end quote. That description, by the way, comes from a Republican-leaning newspaper. The author was Benjamin Bosch, who disliked John Adams quite a bit. But there you go, right? But then there are the Alien and Sedition Acts. In the midst of tensions between France and the United States during the XYZ affair, Congress pushes through the Alien and Sedition Acts, a series of laws focusing on immigration and the press. Federalists warned that immigrants to the United States would become citizens and then promptly go vote for the Republican Party. The Alien Enemies Act said that the president could order the imprisonment or deportation of those suspected of being aliens during war. The Alien Act said the president could do so in a time of peace. Neither was enforced, but rather functioned as quite a threat. The naturalization law required immigrants to have lived in the U.S. for 14 years, rather than 5, which it had been, before applying for citizenship. Federalists leaned towards anti-immigration sentiment at a time when war and revolution in France led to thousands of French immigrants coming to the United States. According to Gordon Wood, quote, "It has been estimated that as much as 10% of the population of Philadelphia in the mid-1790s was French, with French shops, French craftsmen, French newspapers, everywhere in the city." The Sedition Act made it a crime to write or speak anything against the government or those part of it. Famously, Congressman Matthew Lyon from Vermont was found guilty of libel against John Adams, leading to a Republican Party charge against the Alien and Sedition Acts as being unconstitutional. Adams, for his part, saw the acts as a wartime measure, saying tensions with France and the resulting quasi-war justified measures put into place. Republicans, on the other hand, had a political field day with claims of partisanship, unconstitutionality, and unfairness in seemingly targeting Republicans with those laws. In the end, the acts and the hatred towards them unified Republicans much more than they brought the Federalist Party together. Adams, for his part, refused Secretary of State Timothy Pickering's efforts to enforce the Alien Act, but the fact that he signed the factional bills into law was enough to condemn him in the eyes of his political detractors. So why did the bills go into effect? Fear, mostly. Gordon Wood posits that Federalists distrusted that Republicans loved their country more than they loved France. The fear of not knowing what the end result of the French-United States tensions, quasi-war, and XYZ affair would be made everything French suspect. Would France invade? Federalists were not so sure. In any case, after an end to the quasi-war and a cooling of tensions between the United States and France, the acts were allowed to expire after 2 years. We today have the advantage of perspective. We know that the French did not invade. And come to find out, Republicans loved their country just as much as the Federalists did. Political fear can be a powerful motivator, and for Adams, it certainly proved true. Historian Joseph Ellis referred to the Alien and Sedition Acts as, quote, unquestionably the biggest blunder in Adams's presidency. The acts themselves sparked debates about the extent of free speech and a free press at a time when the new nation felt the squeeze of foreign entanglements and the impatience to prove they were a different nation, built on natural rights of men. This decision of Adams, even though he did not push to enforce it, affected how people viewed him and provided political fodder for Republicans leading into the election of 1800. All right, myth number 2. Adams hated, despised, could not stand Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. The reality is that that's kind of true, but it's complicated. I mean, Hamilton and Adams were from the same party, so they had to like each other, right? Not really. Not really. The two did not think much of one another, and political experiences only widened the chasm between them. Of Hamilton, John Adams once remarked to Jefferson that he was, quote, an insolent coxcomb who rarely dined in good company where there was good wine without getting silly and vaporing about his administration, like a young girl about her brilliance and trinkets, end quote. But he was most vicious, perhaps, when mentioning Hamilton's birth, once calling him, quote, the bastard brat of a Scottish peddler. It is telling how much Adams disliked Hamilton that he told the revered George Washington, when the latter insisted that Hamilton be placed second in command of the army proposed to be built during the height of the XYZ affair, that, quote, you are cramming him down my throat, end quote. Hamilton did not have any nicer things to say about Adams, calling him out for his, quote, vanity without bounds and, quote, distempered jealousy. It is safe to say that neither man trusted the other. Adams's distrust stemmed from what he saw as Hamilton's meddling in the 1796 election, believing that Hamilton worked behind the scenes to see the other Federalist candidate, Thomas Pinckney, elected over Adams. The distrust grew during Adams's presidency as the two found themselves on opposite factions within the Federalist Party, Hamilton wanting a fight with France over the Quasi-War, and Adams positioning for peace. Even when Hamilton, who quite frankly was adept at making political enemies, was shot and killed in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr in 1804, John Adams could not bring himself to muster nice things to say about him. According to biographer David McCullough, Adams, quote, would write that though he had forgiven his arch enemy, Hamilton, Hamilton's villainy was not forgotten, nor did he feel obliged to, quote, suffer my character to lie under infamous calumnies because the author of them, with a pistol bullet in his spinal marrow, died a penitent, end quote. But perhaps the toughest rivalry Adams had in his lifetime was with Thomas Jefferson. The truth is, these guys had been friends. They were Revolution buddies, fighting for the same cause during the War for Independence. When the fight was won, however, and the Constitution ratified, both these men found themselves on opposite sides of the political aisle, which can work to end friendships and relationships, or so I'm told. So what led to their dramatic falling out? The 1800 presidential election was the main event, causing a rift between Adams and Jefferson that lasted for over a decade. During Adams's presidency, Jefferson certainly disagreed with him and even secretly contributed with Madison to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which suggested, this was during the height of the pushback over the Alien and Sedition Acts, that states could nullify federal laws and even secede if they wanted to. But the election of 1800 was next level nasty, when it came to political mudslinging. Adams at first seemed above all the political machinations leading into that election. Jefferson, on the other hand, was wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. He was contacting supporters and figuring out how many votes he needed per state. He was like a CNN analyst on election night, right? The most divisive part of that campaign was the insults hurled from all political sides. On the Republican side, accusations against Adams bordered on the ridiculous. According to a Forbes article, journalist, quote, James Callender wrote that Adams was a rageful, lying, warmongering fellow, a repulsive pedant and gross hypocrite who behaved neither like a man nor like a woman, but instead possessed a hideous, hermaphroditical character, end quote. As for Federalists, they claimed that if Jefferson were elected, wives and daughters across the country would be sold into prostitution. One accusation even went so far as to say that electors would be throwing away their votes if they voted for Jefferson because he was dead. He was not. In the end, the election was a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The House of Representatives, after many votes, 36, elected Jefferson president and Burr vice president. While it is true that Adams was bitterly disappointed in his former friend for the political vitriol spewed at him and accusations made about him, it is telling that he and Abigail Adams both wrote that they preferred Jefferson to Burr. The Adamses even invited Jefferson to dine with them, an invitation Jefferson accepted. Nonetheless, the two were not friendly, not like they had been during the Revolution. It was not until years later, and at the behest of mutual friend Benjamin Rush, that Jefferson and Adams began to correspond with one another again. Rush reminded Adams of a visit from some Virginians who had known Jefferson. Adams had reportedly exclaimed his continued affection for Jefferson, and the two men traveling home to Virginia happened upon Jefferson and told him. Jefferson wrote to Rush that, quote, I only needed this knowledge to revive towards him, Adams, all the affections and the most cordial moments of our lives, end quote. In turn, Adams wrote to Jefferson. He wrote him a note on January 1st, 1812, New Year's Day, and they continued to correspond back and forth for the rest of their lives, talking about their shared experiences, their political legacies as revolutionaries. They had an awful lot to say about that, their families, as well as a number of other subjects. Adams and Jefferson were friends again. And perhaps one of the most poignant historical moments in American history, at least as it involves revolutionaries. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. Jefferson died that morning. Adams, unaware, uttered his last words before passing later that day. Quote, Jefferson lives. Maybe the enduring legacy of both these men, or at least one of them, is that we can rise above politics after all. Or not. Myth 3. Adams was an insufferable curmudgeon. Reality, not true, at least not to me. I don't see him as an insufferable curmudgeon. Here's why. So Ron Chernow, he was probably best known for his biography on Alexander Hamilton, which became the basis for Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical phenomenon, Hamilton. I think he describes Adams best. He describes him as, quote, short and punchy, with a round, jowly face and a pale complexion. He had piercing eyes that protruded behind thick lids. He had an exceedingly active mind, always bubbling with words. Because he bared his psyche in diaries and letters, we know him more intimately than any other founder, end quote. It's interesting that Adams himself had a pretty similar description. If he were describing himself, according to biographer William Leuchtenberg, Adams believed he should be seen as, quote, a short, thick, fat archbishop, and acknowledged that he was, quote, puffy, vain, conceited. He also knew that he could be direct, once saying, quote, popularity was never my mistress, nor was I ever, or shall I ever be, a popular man, end quote. But as acerbic and self-reflective as he could be, his measure should not be solely in his blunt thoughts on politics and life. Indeed, the best measure, I think, of his tenderness and affection could be found with his family, and namely his beloved wife, Abigail, who would, by the way, in her own way, prove a loyal and tough supporter of her husband against his political enemies. In one letter, Adams speaks of how much Abigail's correspondence meant to him, saying that her letters, quote, give me more entertainment than all the speeches I hear, exclaiming in another letter that, quote, I can do nothing without you. She was an intellect as well, writing about all sorts of topics, including women's rights, and even famously imploring her husband to, quote, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember that all men would be tyrants if they could. This was at a time when Adams and other revolutionaries were set to break away from England, forming an independent nation. He did not listen, but the letters between the two were frequent and heartfelt. He could also be just as tender when discussing his children. He was exceedingly proud of his son, John Quincy. According to Leuchtenberg, at one point, the son wrote to Abigail that he would not seek office just because his father was president, finding that doing so would be, quote, totally destitute of a personal sense of delicacy. Abigail showed the letter to John, and John showed the letter to everyone, saying, quote, it is the most beautiful thing I have ever read. When his son became president in his own right in the 1824 election, John Adams celebrated, though he also stated, quote, no man who ever held the office of president would congratulate a friend on obtaining it. He also expressed deep sorrows when losing some of his family, writing to his son Charles's widow after Charles had died of cirrhosis of the liver shortly after Adams's loss to Jefferson in the 1800 election, quote, I would to God I could administer to you that comfort which I stand in need of myself. In 1811, he suffered another blow when his adult daughter, Abigail, whom the family called Nabby, noticed a lump in her breast that turned out to be cancer. The family consulted with some of the best doctors of the day, including Benjamin Rush. Rush, in turn, said that the only way forward was a mastectomy, which was performed at the Adamses' house with no anesthesia. I cannot even imagine. There were 4 surgeons that day, and according to biographer David McCullough, they all told Adams that, quote, they had never known a patient to show such fortitude. Unfortunately, 3 years later, her cancer returned. Both John and Abigail were shattered by her death. John, writing to his son, John Quincy, quote, I am grateful and resigned, choosing to see her death as a blessing because of her prolonged illness. But perhaps his greatest grief was in the loss of his wife, Abigail. In 1818, she had contracted typhoid fever. Upon her diagnosis, Adams wrote to Jefferson, quote, the dear partner of my life for 54 years as a wife and for many more years as a lover now lies in extremis, forbidden to speak or to be spoken to. When Abigail, a few days before her death, woke up and told her husband that she was dying and that she was ready, he came downstairs to exclaim, quote, I wish I could lie down beside her and die too. But perhaps one of the sweetest tributes John made to Abigail after her death is recounted in McAuliffe's biography of him. Quote, "For years afterward, whenever complimented about John Quincy and his role in national life and the part that Adams had played as father, Adams would say with emphasis, 'My son had a mother.'" So, was John Adams a grump? Yes, but a cuddly one. Adams is one of my favorite founding fathers. He was principled to a fault, would usually say what he thought, had a self-deprecating way about him, and loved his family and friends. He was truly the great, cuddly curmudgeon. Thank you.
All right, now I know you're pumped for James Madison, the most boring of the founding fathers. But intellectually, smart, I guess you say. I think he's a little bit boring. But Madison, I want to kind of frame this for us as we start. Madison is, everywhere you look, he is considered the father of the Constitution. Like if you look at James Madison Foundation or like anything like that, they will represent him as the father of the Constitution. But I want to frame this where I think we, and I say think as in evidence-based, that we in the modern era absolutely consider him the founding father, the father of the Constitution. But the people who were living in the 1787 did not think of him as the father of the Constitution, because the people in 1787 didn't know who he was. Okay, so we're going to talk, that's the first big myth, but we're going to cover a few other myths, and I need y'all to know, you all might not think that's very controversial, but if this is a room full of historians, I just started a war. So we're going to talk about three myths. The first two are the biggest one. The last one encompasses a much more broader myth. But the first myth that we're going to discuss is, was James Madison or James Madison being the father of the Constitution? Two, that Madison's Federalist Paper number 10 was the most crucial of the Federalist Papers. Nobody read it. Number three, did the framers believe in republics and did they despise democracy? Okay, I have a slide for each one of these, so don't stress too much. But these are the three myths that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to start with the most controversial. Is Madison the father of the Constitution? So in 1787, I picked these pictures, by the way, because they're more 1780s pictures, so you can kind of get a look of what they would look like then, because we frequently see Washington when he's much older, when he's retired much later. But in 1787, when the representatives meet in Philadelphia to convene the Constitutional Convention, no one had heard of Madison. Right? But literally everybody who was there knew and had heard of Washington. And so you can make an argument that Washington's presence is crucial. Like, this is not debatable, by the way. Most historians agree that Washington brings credibility to the convention, that this is why people trust the convention, because they trusted Washington. And it's true. Washington, at the end of the American Revolution in 1783, he had dissolved his army. He did not use his army to coup the government and place himself as the monarch like Oliver Cromwell had during the English Civil Wars, like Napoleon will, like Julius Caesar does, right, with the Roman Republic. And that meant something, right, especially to people in the way they viewed him and the trust that they had put into him. Even at the convention itself, the men who are there are largely Washington's men. A third of the delegates are veterans of the Continental Army. 5 of the 55 who show up were aide-de-camps in the American Revolution. So not to mention that he is made president of the convention, and of course he's very lovingly and frequently called Mr. President. Not to mention that the executive branch and the descriptor of president is very much curtailed, created for a Washingtonian type of a figure, okay? Like in the Constitution itself. And so it was largely Washington's men, not Madison's men. Now, that doesn't mean that when Madison comes with his ideas that those aren't important ideas. They're just not unique ideas. The conversation has already started about what this Constitution will look like. So the goal, and this is the argument, so why Washington is the father of the Constitution and not Madison, is because the argument for the Constitution, like you may say Madison brings separation of powers, but that's not new either. He got that from Montesquieu. Okay? So what I mean is that Washington from 1783 has already started discussing the need for some sort of national government, and the reason for a national government is very geostrategic for Washington. And what I mean by geostrategic is that Washington knows that regardless of the government itself, that a new nation is weak. And this new nation is weak with a very predatory Europe. And the need for a national government will be directly related to the need for defense and to the need for survival of an American institution. So Washington, even before Madison starts talking about the type of government that he wants to talk about, Washington has already started talking about that. And it's not just Washington. He's having this conversation with other people. So he realizes that it's going to be hard to protect the revolution. It's going to be hard to protect an independent America with 13 individual states with individual state sovereignty. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean he's, pushed for that right after the war, but he is talking to a lot of people in correspondence and things like that. So you have this, constitutional system, and a lot of the constitutional system that we talk about, your separation of powers. Of course, there is the compromise over a unicameral versus bicameral legislature, but these are old hat by the 70s. Like or by the 1780s. This is not necessarily. They're not coming up with this on their own. Okay, they're the first ones to implement this. But they are getting these ideas from Enlightenment thinkers who have been writing about political philosophy. Even the social contract concept of the Declaration of Independence, of that if your government is not serving your people, if your government is violating the natural rights that people have of life, liberty, and property, then you, the subjects, have the right to change your government, right? That's Locke. So what is unique about the American experience is not that they made up the ideas themselves, is that they are the first one to make a government surrounded by these ideas, okay? But part of this is driven by a need for foreign policy. And so I want to read you a little excerpt from a letter that Washington writes, William Gordon, in July of 1783, where he is talking about how we're going to need a stronger government than what the Articles of Confederation, the first government in the United States, created, if you will. So here's an expert. Washington says, and I quote, "It now rests with the confederated powers by the line of conduct they mean to adopt, to make this country great, happy, and respectable, or to sink into littleness. Worse happens, into anarchy and confusion. For certain I am that unless adequate powers are given to Congress for the general purpose of the federal union, that we shall soon molder into dust and become contemptible in the eyes of Europe. If we are not made the sport of their politics, to suppose that the general concerns of this country can be directed by 13 heads or one head without competent powers is solecism. the bad effects of which every man who has had the practical knowledge to judge from that I have is fully convinced of, though more perhaps has felt them if in so favorable and distressing degree. So in 1783, when the war ends, Washington is already concerned that having an Article of Confederation government where the 13 powers have sovereign power, but the national government has no power, and by no power, I mean cannot raise revenue. If you can't raise revenue, you can't have an army. The only way they could have revenue is if states gave them revenue, but states don't have to give them revenue. So are states going to give them revenue? No, right? So he's already skeptical about what the Articles of Confederation will be able to do. Will they be able to defend the gains of the Revolution, right? So I'm trying to show you, I'm not disparaging Madison, okay? I'm just trying to show you that there's a bigger conversation happening here, right? That isn't just Madison showing up with brilliance and bestowing it on everybody at the convention. So most of the things, though, that Madison advocates for at the convention, they're not bad things. They just get voted down, you know. So, for example, Madison advocated for the Senate, you know, the Senate, the upper chamber of Congress. The way it functions is equal representation, meaning every state has 2 representatives. Madison wanted the Senate to be population-based. Right? He wanted both the House and the Senate to be based on population. That is voted down, right? He doesn't win that fight. He also wanted Congress to be able to veto state laws. That doesn't get voted in. He wanted certain leading judges, which by leading judges, I'm assuming he means, you know, your Circuit Court of Appeals judges or your Supreme Court judges, to aid the president or the executive power in vetoing legislation. And he also wanted to give the federal government broad power to tax exports. These are all things that he champions that never see the light, right, at the convention. So I'm not saying he doesn't do good things. I'm not saying he's not in agreement. I'm saying when he shows up, everybody already agrees with him. You know, he comes with his plan. Now, we do not know as much as we know about the Congressional Convention without Madison. And I think that's why we modernists project a bit on him. Because Madison took immaculate notes, impeccable notes. We thank Madison from the bottom of our historical hearts because we get to know all of these things that are happening in conversation. But that's why I say we think of him as the father of the Constitution, but people in the 1780s didn't, right? There's a difference there. Because how can they? They don't know him. Now, part of the problem with the convention, of course, I'm assuming if you're in 1301, you're going to talk about this. If you're not, you're going to get to it. But one of the problems that they encounter is, of course, ratification of the Constitution. You know, and all the worries and fears about giving national government too much power. You have your anti-federalist arguments versus your federalist arguments. And so this is where, obviously, Washington's huge, because Washington brings that credibility. And when they are going to try to convince the public to support this new government, Washington writes to the Confederation Congress where he outlines a bit of what he hopes this government can achieve. I'm going to read you a little quote here. He says, and I quote, "In all deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, and perhaps our national existence." Right? Now, this will go into a bit of our second, but before I transition a little bit to the arguments in the Federalist Papers and how we convince people to vote in favor of the Constitution, I want to say that there is no Constitution without Washington. Even if you think that James Madison is the father of the Constitution, it doesn't get completed, it doesn't get ratified, it doesn't get any of those things without Washington, right? Like Washington, of course, will be made the very first president of this government. If you're curious about how much people don't know who Madison is. He runs for the United States Senate first, and he loses. And then eventually he will secure a position in the House. So this is what we call historical memory. If you ever go on to study history more, right? How we remember history versus how people experienced it in real time. So even though I'm challenging or attempting to challenge your ideas about what you think you know about the founding, it doesn't mean that we don't see him as being influential. That's called hindsight. Like Professor Reed said, perspective. We have the benefit of seeing how over time people have come to read him more than people read him then. You know, and it's because he wrote about a lot of things that still are problems for the nation and that we still talk about. You know, demography, democracy, minority rights, majority rights. And I think that's part of why we, and I say modern, I mean 100 years, see him in that way. Now, this transitions us a little bit to our second myth, which is that the Federalist Paper number 10 was most important. Have any of you read Federalist Paper number 10? Yeah, nice. This is why. If you've read it, you understand the appeal of it. He talks about two-party system. I mean, you can see the interest of why political philosophers would be interested in it, why politicians would be interested in it. He's talking about representation. He's talking about how can he's using both synonymously, but about how representation and small representative units can work democratically across large regions, right? He talks about how the Constitution, the way it is, will protect minority rights and will prevent majority rule or majority tyranny. You know, he talks about a lot of things that I don't want to say that they didn't plague them in the 1780s, because of course it did plague them. But I think these are things that over time, as a nation, the nation becomes more interested in, as the nation grows, right, as things change. Now, in 1788, right, or 1787, when they realized that they need to convince our two biggest states, New York and Virginia, to hop on the Constitution board, because by 1788, 9 states have ratified the Constitution. They have the 3/4 number they need to go with it. But just because you have the numbers you need to go with it, does that make it legitimate if most people live in New York and Virginia? I mean, it's going to be a hard time convincing them, if most of your population isn't in those states. You need your biggest states to be on board. So this, of course, creates your kind of internal debate. You're anti-federalist, even though you're anti-federalist are making a federalist position, definition-wise, versus your federalist. And so this is where Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton are going to they're going to start writing pamphlets. They'll start as pamphlets. They will then become an edited collection that you can read as a whole. But they will write these pamphlets anonymously. Their name is Publius. That is the name that they write with. And these are all designed with how to explain how the government works, right, to people, to explain the separation of powers, the checks and balances, really to ease any fears that this government will become tyrannical, that this government will oppress individual rights for its sake of power. And so in this, there's a lot of these, right? There's a lot of these, but the first 8, like 1 through 8, are going to be the most widely read. And if you're curious about how we know what is most widely read, you should be. It should be a question you ask, because historically this is something you have to prove. And it can be really hard to prove how you know that people read certain things. Okay, but one of the ways intellectual historians trace this and kind of trace the idea and how many people are reading it is, do they go to reprint? How many reprints are there of these things? And 1 through 8 will be widely reprinted. Number 10 never is. Okay, so in 1 through 8, these are going to be the focus. And the focus of 1 through 8 are largely a restating of that geostrategic argument that Washington has already been talking about, right? The need to go away from this concept of states having sovereignty and go to a more national unity. And one way that they talk about this in the Federalist Papers is they explain it, one, by comparing the Union to Scotland and England, where they talk about how, yes, England is this small British nation. You know, the English Channel protects them from a lot of continental wars. And in 1707, you have the Act of Union that unites Scotland and England. Yes, England was just as powerful all alone, but they're even more so when the two are united. And they compare America to that, right? The Atlantic Ocean being this barrier of protection. But they also talk about how one of the problems with this, or one of the problems with sovereignty to the states and not a national union, is to look at Europe. They use Europe as example. Europe has all of these sovereign nations, and what do? Use expenditures on massive militaries, fight over borders, massive wars of bloodshed constantly between these different nations. And when I say nations, y'all, you know how many European states you can fit in Texas? Right? This nation is much, much larger. And so that's part of why they're comparing Europe. You know, a European country can be the equivalent to a state, if you will, in the United States, you know? So they are talking about how a national unity of sovereign states, because that's what the Constitution creates, right? A sovereign union of sovereign states. I always think of it like a bubble in a bubble, right? States do have certain sovereignty. States do have power over certain laws. And then there are certain things that the national government has power over. But that sovereign union is the key to defense. And it's really hard, I think, for us. I mean, it's historians, too. They just really train you in this. They kind of beat it into you. To look back on this and be like, it doesn't really make sense. But it does. We are looking at a 21st century United States, which is very different than an 18th century United States. And an 18th century United States is a former colony that is incredibly weak that Europe wants to recolonize. You know, so that is part of, and this is what made sense to most people in the era, right? We need protection from recolonization. We need protection from England, from France, from Spain. And so this is part of why those things are reprinted, because this is what clicked for most people. Now Madison will be appealing later because we will have issues. There's a difference in creating a government intellectually, philosophically, what you think it will do, how you think it will work. And you learn things when you then apply said government, okay? Like, for example, Professor Reed talked about Alien Sedition Acts. Madison was a Federalist. And by 1798, he's like, woof, I don't know about that. I think we gave the judiciary too much power. You know? So that's what I mean. Is in theory, he thought this would work. A decade in, after using said government in real time with foreign policy, with domestic policy, they're going to figure out that just because they thought it would work didn't mean that other forces acting upon it weren't going to change how they thought it would work. That makes any sense? You know, whether that's Britain bullying the merchants or seizing trade or impressing sailors into the Navy that nobody wants to join. You know, those are forces that you cannot anticipate that will act upon said government and how people make decisions, how they react, all of that. You can't know that. You can just create the best you can to try to accommodate those scenarios that may emerge, right? So Federalist number 10 is interesting to us, but that wasn't their focus in 1787. And then lastly, because I think this is hard too for a lot of people in our modern era because we think of these things a little bit differently. But the last myth I want to talk about with you all is this myth of did the founders love republics and despise democracy? And do they distinguish these things? You know, are they really specific in distinguishing these two words? And Madison, he talks about this. And Madison does write about He gets really in the weeds, I mean, he's an intellectual. He wants to parse out these ideas. He gets into this, and he talks about how republics are about representation. He talks more about democracy as being a form of populism. And he does, in some of his writings, distinguish between republics and democracy as being very different things. And he's not necessarily unique. It's not common for people to distinguish it in that way in this period, but he's not the only one, is what I'm saying. But most people, like your Federalist, they are pushing back against this. They are putting these two words together. They are using them interchangeably. Most popular people, like just regular people who you're talking to, they would have also understand these things as being related and similar. Maybe there's some differences, like, for example, you can have a republic, and it can be a direct participation or indirect participation. So, for example, at the beginning, the Senate was indirect representation, right? So, well, it's like let's say you're in Virginia. If you're in Virginia, you would vote for your state legislature, and then your state legislature, right, would vote for your national senators. That's more indirect. Then you get the 17th Amendment. Is it 17? Off the top of my head. Thank you, Mick. The 17th Amendment that says, well, I misspeak with numbers. The direct election of senators, that will make it where, like in Texas, all of you, if you are 18 and you have registered to vote, you get to vote on who your Senate representation will be. Right? That's more direct representation. Okay? So they distinguish that as, is there a direct involvement? Is there indirect involvement? And so a lot of them, not Madison, but a lot of them are going to use those things interchangeably. And so that is why they will call things a representative democracy, or they'll call it a republic in one speech and a democracy in the other. So most of these words are used interchangeably. Even with the British Parliament, you have, like, if we're taking us out of America, right, and looking at how that word is used, you even see people talking about the British Parliament, and when they speak particularly about the House of Commons as being, which is representative, as being democratic or democratical. Now, look, the American Congress is much more democratic than the British House of Commons, because your House of Commons is like second sons and merchants, but they are elected. There is an elected portion to it. So that's why people would call it democratic, even if it's not pure democracy, right? Because I think that's where the distinction comes in. Madison is thinking pure democracy. Pure democracy means you got to participate in everything. Like everything your legislature would do, you would vote in. Y'all, that would get messy, and we would just stop doing it. So that is what he means when he's distinguishing. And so even though Madison, for example, does try to write and distinguish between these two types of systems and how they work, he, even in his own writings, will use them interchangeably. Like you have in his Federalist Paper number 10, he says in one section, the Republican remedy for the disease most incident to Republican government. So he's saying there are remedies to fix the problems with Republican government. In his notes at the convention, he says the same thing, but uses democracy instead of republic. So he's using his notes from the convention to write his Federalist Paper, but he's using them interchangeably. Now, I'm assuming you're like, who is this dude with the cool glasses? This guy is James Wilson, and he was at the Philadelphia Convention. Arguably, he's one of the most important men at the Philadelphia Convention. He does a lot of talking, a lot of arguing and debating, and even in that convention, he uses these same words interchangeably. So, for example, he notes in one of his speeches in the convention, he says, all authority of every kind is denied by representation from the people, and the democratic principle is carried into every part of the government. So he's saying even the republic is derived from the power of the people, which is democratic, which is democracy. And then he calls it democracy in the next line. And I tell you this because, again, modern interpretations, modern understandings of constitutions and words they use and how they think versus how they thought back then. Like, you have a lot of people in the modern era who'd be like, well, the United States is a republic, not a democracy. That's not what they said, right? It's both. It's both. But it's a representative democracy, and they use it as both. So, Madison, I don't want to say, I don't mind Madison. I like reading Madison. I just think Madison is writing to really understand, to pick things apart, to kind of, how would I say? My father would say to shuck it down to the cob, which means let's tease out all of the mess and get to the small minutia, to the small detail, to challenge his way of thinking, to kind of push it into certain areas. But just because he is doing that doesn't mean everybody else is with him. And when I say with him, I mean, on the same language, talking about the same things. Now, more broadly speaking, absolutely. They're all very much on the same page as far as trying to create a system that will not overpower, individual rights. That's why even a Madison is completely okay with the demand for a Bill of Rights for the first 10 amendments to the Constitution to be appended, even though he thinks it can protect itself. I feel like 1787 Madison would be like, it's good, we don't need amendments. 1798 Madison is like, we absolutely need amendments. So there is evolution to these people too, because I'm going to quote Maya Angelou. Let's bring it to an end here. You do the best you can until you know better, and when you know better, you do better. And that's true of all people. You're only what you are in that moment. And you learn in real time. And I think that makes Madison to me much more interesting. I don't want a Madison who shows up perfect and is right the whole time. I want a Madison who learns from his mistakes, finds the problems himself, that he may have believed was okay before, but changed his mind later. So I hope I've challenged your brain a little bit. I hope I've given you something controversial to talk about with your friends. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. We're going to have a little Q&A if you have questions. Also, we would love it if you would, the other paper on the table is an evaluation. This just helps us know how you all feel, what you all think. It gives us feedback so we can plan future events and try to come up with topics that you will find interesting. Like, for example, in the fall, we would love to do a panel on the Challenger explosion and do a little bit of the space race and the Cold War. So this is what we mean. We want to get your feedback. Do we have any questions? Huh? Oh. I don't want you to clap. Do you want to do that? You're gonna let Professor do it.
All right, any questions?
I'd just like to know her name.
Oh,
You never announced her name.
oh no.
I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you my name. Professor Haley Stewart. Haley, Hailey. History.
That's important. Names are important. Yes. All right, well, thank you all for coming again, the Thursday before spring break. So we're going to do another one of these. We have, not the week after spring break, but the next week, so March 31st, which is a Tuesday from 12:30 to 2. We're going to do one of these on Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
So it's going to get real rowdy. Those guys had screaming matches in the hallways. We're not going to scream at you, but we'll tell you all about those two guys. So if you're interested in that, we'll get that information out to everybody on campus. Definitely show up for that. Again, thank you for coming. Fill out that evaluation, take some candy, take a drink in the back. Have a great rest of your day.